If you're confused about if you should rent or buy, here are the pros and cons of each, starting with buying a property. The biggest benefit normally people talk about is the fact that you don't have to pay dead rent. When you live in a rental property, that money is paying off someone else's mortgage. But if you can use that monthly money to pay off your own mortgage, that is normally considered better. I don't think that is the most important reason. The most important reason is that if you don't buy a property now, it might be too late. If you look at this graph, it shows a ratio of house prices to people's earnings over the years. So what that means is, how much is a house worth compared to your annual earnings? So if you look at 1969, the ratio was around 3, which means that if you earn £20,000 a year, the houses were generally around £60,000 a year. Over the years, you can see that's gone up and up and up, and all the way in 2020, in London, that ratio is now 12. What that means is if you make £20,000 a year, houses are now not 3 times as much as your income, they're 12 times as much as your income. So to give you an example, this property is currently on Rightmove for £550,000. But if you click property sale history, it shows you all the times when this property was sold. Over the years, property prices have just gone up and up and up. But what has happened to people's incomes at the same stage? So this graph shows you people's median income in the yellow line. If you look at 1996, the median income was around £20,000. So in 1996, the property was sold for £89,000. The house was only 4.5 times your average income. 10 years later, the property was sold for £227,000, but the average income only rose to £27,500. So now the property was 10 times the average income. And in 2023, the property has gone up to £550,000, but the average income is only around £30,000. So now it's 18 times the average income for this particular property. And that trend will only continue to get worse and worse for 3 main reasons. Firstly, because of this.
This is showing you net migration. So the number of people coming in minus those who are leaving the country, in over 700,000 in 2022.
More and more people are coming into the country, which means there's a huge demand for housing. Now, at the same time, the demand isn't just from people looking for homes or buy-to-let investors. It's also from large corporations like Lloyds Bank, who are aiming to become UK's largest landlord with 50,000 homes. So certainly there's a huge amount of demand also coming from the corporates. But what's happening to the supply? This graph shows the new homes completed by private companies, housing associations, and local authorities in the UK from 1949 to 2022. Put simply, how many houses are built in the UK over the last 70 years? If you look at 1970, that was a peak where they built 400,000 houses. The demand for housing is around 300,000 houses every single year. They've been saying this for years and years. But if you look at the trend, in 2022, they only built 200,000 houses, which is half of what they were building in the 1970s. The large reason for this is, if you look at that light gray area, a lot of those properties were built by the local authorities, which are the local councils. Since the 1970s, that's been diminishing and local authorities no longer build houses. So really the housing nowadays, which is in the light blue graph, is coming from the private enterprise, which are the private developers. The housing associations don't really build much, the local authorities don't build much anymore, and the supply is going down because less and less properties are being built. As a result, the house price earning multiple, which we saw earlier, I think will just continue to go up and up and up and up because property prices will continue to go up, but at the same time, I don't see wages increasing at the same pace. The benefit of buying a property today is the fact that your income still might be sufficient in order for you to buy a property, but the longer you leave it and the more and more unaffordable it becomes, you might have a situation whereby you can't afford to buy a house anymore. But if you do decide to buy a house, this is the way you make real money from property. So going back to the example we saw earlier, let's say you bought this property in 1996 for £89,000. So let's say you put down a 10% deposit and you got a 90% mortgage. Over the years, the property price has gone up and up and up all the way to £550,000. But if your mortgage is for 90%, which in this case is around, let's say £80,000, assuming you have an interest-only mortgage, your mortgage still stays exactly the same. The amount of money you borrow from the bank is still exactly the same. It's still £89,000, and so the red line is perfectly straight. But because property prices have gone up and up and up and up, all of that appreciation, that is essentially the money you have made. Without really doing anything, you're just benefiting from inflation and the fact that the economy is improving. Yes, the money you're borrowing from the bank, you have to pay interest on that, but that interest is going to be nowhere near as much as how much you've made from that appreciation over time. So people say the 8th wonder of the world is compounding. In order to get wealthy, you need to invest in things which go up up in price, and therefore that compounds over time because as it grows, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if you buy a property which is going up in price over time, then you're going to benefit from that. Whereas if you're renting a property, the landlord gets all the appreciation, so you're not going to be compounding your wealth. That might seem like a very solid case as why you should 100% buy a property, but there is a flip side. Realistically, if you do buy a property, you're not exactly going to get wealthy. And if your ambition is to maybe do property investing as a full-time job or have enough passive income to do whatever you want to do, then buying a property might not be the best way, and you might actually be better off renting. Let me explain why. Let's say you start off with £100,000 in savings. It could be £50,000, £100,000, whatever that amount is. If you then buy a property to live in, now you have no money left. Now you're down to zero. And fine, you have a house which is going up in price over time. If you buy a house today for £200,000 and in 30 years time is worth £2 million, the reality is all the other houses in the area have also gone up in price and you still need a property to live in. So in 30 years time, yes, your house is worth a lot of money, but you still need a place to live in. If you were to sell that house and buy another house, the house down the road would also cost you £2 million. So it's not like you can really cash in on that money to some degree because, well, ultimately, you still need a place to live in. If you really want to make money, you want to be in a situation whereby the money you have to begin with, you use that money to make more money rather than you using that money to buy something which you're now paying off every single month and it doesn't make you anything. So rather than buying a house to live in, you could do something like this. This is a 1-bedroom flat which I bought in West Hampstead in London in pretty terrible condition. It had a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a reception room. I essentially took the kitchen, moved that into the reception room to make that an open plan living room, and then I turned the kitchen into the second bedroom. So the property went from being a 1-bedroom flat into being a 2-bedroom flat. Now I bought that property as a 1-bed for £303,500, and by the time I was done 6 months later, it was worth £450,000, and in the end I made a profit of around £61,000. Let's say today you have £50,000 that you're starting with. You buy a property, you add some value to it, you sell it, and you make £25,000. Well, now you have £75,000. Use that £75,000, do another project, sell it, and you make another £25,000. Well, now you have £100,000. With that money that you're making, you can then use that money to buy investment properties, which are making you rent every single month, and they're going up in value over time. And if you can keep repeating that process again and again, and you have enough rental properties which are making you passive income, you can then use that income to rent a property to live in, and it's being paid for by your own rental properties anyway. And because of the way the mortgage system works in this country, it's much easier to buy investment properties than it is to buy a property to actually live in. For example, let's say your annual salary right now is £30,000. If you want to buy a property to live in, on average, you can normally borrow 5.5 times the amount of money you earn on an annual basis. So if you make £30,000 a year, you can borrow £165,000 from the bank, and that is your ceiling in terms of how much money you can borrow in order to buy a property to live in. But if you're buying an investment property, you can buy something worth £500,000. When you buy an investment property, the rent is paying the mortgage. When you buy a residential property, your income has to pay the mortgage. And if your income isn't that high, then you don't qualify for the mortgage. But you can get an investment property worth hundreds and thousands of pounds because it's got nothing to do with your income. So it's far easier getting investment mortgages than it is getting residential mortgages. And let's say your income was really high and you can buy a £1 million residential property. Once you bought that first property, you now can't buy the second one because you've exhausted all of your income on the first one. Whereas with investment properties, you can buy 10, 20, 30, 40, it doesn't matter because it has nothing to do with your income. If you really want to benefit from capital appreciation and compounding and everything else, you want to be in a situation where you are buying multiple investment properties and they're all going up in value over time, as opposed to just having one property. By the way, you don't have to rent a house to live in and then use that money to buy investment properties. You can use your money to start a business or do whatever you want to do. The point I'm trying to make is the money you have, you're better off using that money to make more money rather than just buying a house and now you're making monthly mortgage payments and not really making any more money. Of course, buying investment properties for me is the easiest way because that's what I know, but for you, that might be something else. Now, having said that, if you're in a situation whereby you definitely want to buy a house to live in because that's your preference, or in your area you can't find a house big enough to rent for your family, or whatever their situation is, then this is the best way of doing that. Using the BRR strategy, you can buy a house to live in, add value to it, and in 6 months time you can get all of your money back and you can then use that money to start buying investment properties. If you want to know how to buy a house to live in, then watch this video here.